On March 12, 1909, 4 bullets killed the only man who could have stopped what was coming. His name was Joseph Petrosino, the most feared detective in America. He had traveled 4,000 miles to destroy the criminal networks, terrorizing Italian immigrants. He never made it home. His murder remains unsolved. But here's what history forgot. Petrosino was not fighting the Mafia. He was fighting something older, something that existed before Al Capone ever poured his first drink. Tonight, we go back to the brutal origins of American organized crime. The year 1920. Prohibition had just begun. But the criminal organizations that would exploit it did not appear from nothing. They had been building for decades. The back rooms of saloons, in the terror of handwritten letters marked with a black hand, in the bloodiest slum America had ever seen. This was crime before it became an empire. No Tommy guns. No Tommy guns. No millions. Just neighborhood gangs, ethnic warfare, and extortion methods so crude they seem medieval today. The men who survived this era would become legends. The methods they developed would shape organized crime forever. To understand organized crime in 1920, we must first travel back to a neighborhood that no longer exists. The Five Points district of Lower Manhattan, named for the intersection of 5 streets, was once called the most dangerous place in America. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and declared it worse than the slums of London. Police officers refused to patrol its streets alone. Respectable citizens crossed to the other side of the road rather than walk past its tenements. From this crucible of poverty and violence emerged the prototype for all American criminal organizations, the 5 Points Gang, led by an Italian immigrant named Paul Kelleborn. Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli controlled the neighborhood through a combination of political connections and brutal enforcement. At its peak in the early 1900s, the gang numbered over 1,500 members, making it one of the largest criminal organizations in American history. What made the 5 Points Gang revolutionary was not its size, but its structure. Kelly understood something that previous gang leaders had not. Crime could be systematic. He divided his territory into sectors, each controlled by a lieutenant responsible for specific operations. Gambling, prostitution, theft, labor racketeering each had its own chain of command, its own revenue stream, its own most significantly, Kelly recognized the value of political protection. He forged alliances with Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that controlled New York City. In exchange for delivering votes through persuasion or intimidation, Kelly received something more valuable than money: immunity. Police who arrested his men found their cases dismissed. Judges who convicted his associates found themselves removed from the bench. The 5 Points Gang had discovered the essential truth of American organized crime. Political power and criminal power were 2 sides of the same coin. Among the young men who learned their trade in the 5 Points were names that would later dominate the history of American crime: Johnny Torrier and Al Capone. They were teenagers when they joined Kelly's organization, running errands and proving their loyalty through small acts of violence. They had no way of knowing that they were being educated for an empire. While the 5 Points Gang operated in the open, protected by political allies, another form of crime flourished in the shadows of Italian immigrant communities across America. They called it La Mano Nera, the Black Hand. The Black Hand was not an organization in any conventional sense. There was no central leadership, no formal membership, no coordinated strategy. It was instead a method, a technique of extortion so effective that it spread spontaneously through Italian neighborhoods from New York to Chicago to New Orleans. The method was simple and terrifying. A businessman would receive a letter demanding money. The letter would be decorated with crude drawings: a skull, a dagger, and always a black hand. The message was clear: pay or die. If the victim refused, his shop might burn, his children might disappear, his body might be found in an alley, throat cut, with a black hand drawn in his own blood on the wall above him. What made the Black Hand particularly insidious was its invisibility. The extortionists were not outsiders, they were neighbors. The man who delivered your bread might be the same man who delivered your death threat. The woman who watched your children might report your movements to the criminals planning your kidnapping. Trust within immigrant communities collapsed. Everyone was a potential informant. Every knock on the door, a potential death sentence. The numbers tell a story of systematic terror. In New York City alone, between 1903 and 1918, police documented over 500 Black Hand letters per year. The actual number was certainly much higher. Most victims never reported the crimes, fearing retaliation. In Chicago, the Black Hand was responsible for over 100 bombings in a single year. Wealthy Italian immigrants began hiring private guards, building panic rooms in their homes, and sending their children away to schools in distant cities. This was not the glamorous crime of the later Prohibition era. There were no celebrities, no newspaper profiles, no romantic narratives of outlaws living large. This was pure neighbor against neighbor, immigrant against immigrant, fear as a business model. Into this world of shadow and fear stepped one of the most remarkable law enforcement officers in American history. Joseph Petrosino was born in Italy in 1860 and immigrated to New York as a child. He joined the New York Police Department in 1883 and quickly distinguished himself through intelligence, bravery, and something rare among officers of his era. Petrosino understood the Black Hand as no American-born officer could. He spoke the language, knew the customs, understood the codes of silence that protected criminals within immigrant communities. In 1904, Police Commissioner Theodore Bingham created a special unit to combat Italian crime and placed Petrosino in command. The Italian Squad, as it became known, was the first ethics-specific law enforcement unit in American history. The results were immediate and dramatic. In his first year commanding the squad, Petrosino arrested over 500 criminals and secured deportation orders for thousands more. He personally went undercover, disguising himself to infiltrate criminal networks. He developed a network of informants within the Italian community, people who trusted him because he was one of them, because he treated them with respect rather than the contempt most officers showed immigrants. But Petrosino's greatest weapon was information. He compiled detailed files on known criminals, their methods, their associates, their weaknesses. He maintained correspondence with police departments across Italy, tracking criminals who had fled their home country. He understood decades before other law enforcement officials that crime was becoming international, and that fighting it required international cooperation. His success made him famous. Newspapers called him the Italian Sherlock Holmes. Italian immigrants across America viewed him as a hero, proof that one of their own could rise to prominence through honest work. You too can become my hero. Just like and subscribe to the channel. But his success also made him a target. The criminals he hunted began hunting him in return. The secret mission in early 1909, Petrosino received permission for a mission that would either destroy the Black Hand forever or cost him his life. He would travel to Italy, to Sicily specifically, and gather criminal records on hundreds of suspects who had fled to America. Armed with this documentation, he could have them deported, emptying the Black Hand of its most dangerous members in a single stroke. The mission was supposed to be secret. Only a handful of people knew Petrosino's destination and purpose. He traveled under an assumed name, told his wife he was going on vacation, and sailed for Europe in February 1909, but the secret did not hold. Someone in history has never determined who leaked information about Petrosino's mission to the newspapers. The New York Herald published a story announcing that the famous detective was traveling to Sicily to gather evidence against Italian criminals. The story was reprinted in Italian newspapers. By the time Petrosino arrived in Palermo, every criminal on the island knew he was coming. He spent 3 weeks gathering records, meeting with Italian police officials, and compiling his evidence. On the evening of March 12th, he left his hotel to meet an informant in the Piazza Marina. He had received a message that someone wanted to provide information about a major criminal figure. It was a trap. 4 men surrounded him as he crossed the square. 4 bullets struck him before he could draw his weapon. He died on the cobblestones, his secret documents scattered around him, his life's work left unfinished. The murder of Joseph Petrosino sent shockwaves through both sides of the Atlantic. In New York, over 250,000 people lined the streets for his funeral procession, the largest in the city as history at that time. In Italy, the government launched an investigation that would drag on for decades without producing a conviction. Who ordered the killing? The evidence points to Don Vito Ferrara, a Sicilian crime boss with extensive connections to criminals in America. But the triggermen were never identified, and the conspiracy behind the assassination has never been fully unraveled. What died with Petrosino was more than a man. It was a certain kind of hope, the belief that one dedicated officer could stem the tide of organized crime through intelligence and courage alone. The criminals had learned a lesson. Anyone who threatened them, no matter how powerful or protected, could be eliminated. The age of impunity had begun. To understand how crime operated in 1920, we must understand its economics. The romantic image of the gangster wealthy, powerful, living in luxury did not yet exist. Most criminals of this era were not rich. They were merely less poor than their neighbors. The primary revenue streams were accrued by later standards. Extortion remained the foundation. The Black Hand method systematized and expanded. Protection rackets targeted small businesses, demanding monthly payments in exchange for not destroying their shops. Gambling operations ran in the back rooms of saloons and social clubs. Prostitution was controlled through violence, with women treated as property to be bought and sold. Labor racketeering emerged as a particularly lucrative field. As unions gained power in the early 20th century, criminals discovered they could profit from both sides of labor disputes. They would hire themselves out as strikebreakers to factory owners, then turn around and extort payments from union leaders. Some criminals actually took control of unions themselves, using the membership dues as a steady income stream and the threat of strikes as leverage against employers. The numbers, by later standards, were modest. A successful blackhand extortionist might collect $5,000 or $10,000 in a year, a fortune by immigrant standards, but nothing compared to the millions that Prohibition would soon generate. A gambling operation might clear a few $100s per week. Even the most successful criminals of the pre-Prohibition era were, in financial terms, small businessmen. But they were learning, they were developing methods, they were building networks, and they were waiting, though they did not know it, for the opportunity that would transform their neighborhood operations into a national industry. Crime in 1920 was fundamentally local. There were no national organizations, no coordinated territories, no agreements between cities. Instead, there was constant war for neighborhood against neighborhood, ethnicity against ethnicity, gang against gang. The streets of major cities were divided into territories, as clearly defined as any national border. In New York, different blocks might be controlled by different organizations. The 5 Points belonged to Italian gangs. The Lower East Side was Jewish territory. The Hell's Kitchen neighborhood on the West Side was Irish. Each group defended its territory with violence, and viewed incursion from outsiders as an act of war. These territorial conflicts produced casualties that would rival any military engagement. In Chicago alone, over 200 gang-related murders occurred in the years leading up to Prohibition. New York was worse. Bodies appeared in alleys, floating in rivers, buried in the foundations of buildings under construction. Most murders were never solved. Witnesses refused to talk, police were often complicit, and the victims themselves were usually criminals whose deaths troubled no one in authority. What made these conflicts particularly brutal was their personal nature. In later decades, organized crime would become corporate, violence would be business, nothing personal. But in 1920, everything was personal. Insults demanded revenge. Disrespect required blood. A criminal who killed a rival was not simply eliminating competition, he was defending his honor, his family, his very identity. The survivors of these neighborhood wars would become the leaders of the next generation. They had been hardened by violence, educated in betrayal, and stripped of whatever innocence they might once have possessed. They were ready for Prohibition. They just did not know it yet. On the 16th of January, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal throughout the nation. Reformers celebrated. Churches rang their bells. Newspapers predicted a new era of sobriety and moral improvement. In the back rooms and social clubs of criminal neighborhoods, a different celebration was taking place. The men who had spent years fighting over scraps, extortion payments, gambling profits, prostitution revenues, suddenly found themselves presented with the greatest business opportunity in American history. Every adult in America wanted to drink. Every drink they consumed would now be illegal. Every illegal drink would need to be supplied by someone willing to break the law. The criminals were willing. But the transformation was not instant. On that January morning, organized crime was still what it had been the day before. Local, fragmented, violent, and relatively small-time. The structures that would later allow criminal organizations to operate like corporations, the territorial agreements, the supply chains, the political connections at the national level did not yet exist. What existed was potential. The men who had learned their trade in the 5 Points, who had survived the neighborhood wars, who had built networks through extortion and gambling and labor racketeering. These men had skills that suddenly became extraordinarily valuable. They knew how to operate outside the law. They knew how to use violence strategically. They knew how to corrupt officials. They knew how to build organizations. The next decade would transform them from neighborhood thugs into national figures. But that transformation began here, in this moment, in this opportunity that appeared like a gift from heaven or hell. Our transformation also begins now with your like and a friend's like. Share this video with your friend who thinks they're a detective. Among those celebrating on that January night were 2 young men who had come to symbolize the Prohibition era, Johnny Torrio and his protege, Alphonse Capone. Their stories illuminate how the old crime became the new, how the lessons learned in the brutal years before 1920 were applied to build something unprecedented. Johnny Torrio had graduated from the 5 Points gang to Chicago, where he worked for his uncle. Big Jim Colosimo running gambling and prostitution operations. Torrio was unusual among criminals of his era. He preferred negotiation to violence, planning to impulsiveness, organization to chaos. He saw Prohibition coming and understood immediately what it meant. He urged Colosimo to prepare to invest in breweries and distribution networks. Before Colosimo refused, he was making enough money from his existing operations. He saw no need to risk expansion. On May 11, 1920, just 4 months after Prohibition began, Big Jim Colosimo was shot to death in the vestibule of his own restaurant. The murder was never officially solved, but the beneficiary was obvious. Johnny Torrio took control of the organization and immediately began the expansion he had long planned. He sent for his young protege from New York, Al Capone, who had been working as a bouncer and low-level enforcer. Capone was 21 years old, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. Under Torrio's guidance, he would learn how to build an empire. But that empire lay in the future. In 1920, Capone was nobody, a promising young criminal learning his trade, applying the lessons of the 5 points to the new opportunity of bootlegging. The legend had not yet been born. The monster was still growing. Joseph Petrosino has been dead for over a century now. The criminals he fought have been dead nearly as long. The neighborhoods they terrorize have been demolished and rebuilt. The tenements replaced by skyscrapers, the cobblestone streets buried under asphalt. But something of that era survives not in buildings or documents, but in the very structure of organized crime itself. The methods developed in the Black Hand letters are still used today. The territorial organization pioneered by the 5 Points Gang became the model for criminal organizations worldwide. The corruption of political officials, the infiltration of legitimate businesses, the use of violence as a business tool, all of these techniques were refined in the years before Prohibition and have never been abandoned. We remember the gangsters of the 1920s and 30s because they were spectacular. They lived large, died dramatically, and left behind legends that Hollywood has never tired of retelling. But they did not create organized crime. They inherited it. They refined it. They scaled it up to industrial proportions. The real creators were the men who came before the Black Hand extortionists, who terrorized their own communities. The 5 Points gangsters who first understood the value of political protection. The neighborhood warriors who learned to kill without conscience. These were not glamorous figures. They were brutal, petty, and largely forgotten by history. Perhaps that is appropriate. They operated in shadows, and to shadows they have returned. But Joseph Petrosino deserves to be remembered. He died trying to prevent what eventually came to pass. Understood before almost anyone else that crime was becoming organized, that the scattered violence of immigrant neighborhoods was coalescing into something larger and more dangerous. He gave his life trying to stop it. Failed. It failed, but in his failure, he showed us what courage looks like when it stands alone against the darkness. The darkness won. It usually does. But sometimes, that makes the light more valuable, not because it prevailed, but because it existed at all. History is not just what we remember. The criminals and heroes of the pre-Prohibition era shaped everything that followed. This channel exists to tell the stories that others have overlooked, to show how the past connects to the present in ways we rarely recognize. Subscribe to continue the journey. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new exploration. Leave a comment telling us which era of criminal history you want us to investigate. The truth is always more interesting than the myth.